Picking up my husband at O'Hare Airport, I ran straight into Julian Vance, my ex-fiancé, who vanished on our wedding day 2 years ago because his adopted sister, Maya, needed to find herself in Bali. Julian waved arrogantly. Beside him, Leo, his 8-year-old orphaned nephew, dropped his crayons. Maya sighed, kicking them aside to claim a VIP seat. I walked over, gathered the crayons, and firmly blocked Maya's path. If you've ever run into a toxic person you hope to never see again, tell me where you're listening from and the time right now. Julian just smiled. Julian did not see the coldness in my eyes. He saw exactly what he wanted to see: a woman standing in front of him, frozen in place, utterly captivated by his sudden return. He stepped forward, dragging a designer suitcase with one hand while the other casually rested on Maya's shoulder. They looked ridiculously out of place, draped in expensive resort wear that screamed of a tropical vacation funded entirely by the family's corporate credit card. "Evelyn," Julian said, his voice dripping with that familiar, unearned confidence. He let out a soft chuckle, as if my presence here was the punchline to a joke only he understood. "Look at you. I knew you would not be able to stay away." I did not blink. I did not step back. I simply handed the small box of crayons to Leo. The little boy took them with trembling fingers, his wide, tired eyes darting nervously toward his uncle. Leo was the forgotten collateral damage of the Vance family, an orphaned nephew who was treated more like a piece of misplaced luggage than a grieving child. "Don't be mad, Evelyn," Julian continued, completely ignoring the boy at his side. He reached over and gently patted Maya's hair, a gesture meant to showcase his unwavering nobility. "I know 2 years is a long time, but I am back now. And once we finally get married, we will be a united front. You will be here to help me take care of Maya." Maya looked up at me from her stolen VIP seat, her lips curled into a faint, triumphant smirk. She was 24 years old, but she played the role of a helpless, fragile child with terrifying precision. She crossed her arms, her diamond bracelets catching the harsh fluorescent lights of the airport terminal. I looked at Julian through the dark tint of my sunglasses. In the past, his charming smile might have caused my heart to race. I used to look at him and see a future. Now, as a lead architect, my brain automatically categorized things by structural integrity. I looked at Julian Vance and saw a building with a rotting foundation. I saw cheap materials, a flashy facade, and a complete lack of load-bearing support. He was a disaster waiting to happen, and I was no longer the contractor hired to fix him. He was entirely structurally compromised. The $120 million gift. Julian mistook my silence for submission. He took a step closer, crowding my personal space, practically vibrating with the kind of arrogance that only came from a lifetime of zero consequences. "I saw the news online while we were waiting for our connection in Dubai," Julian said, his chest puffing out with pride. "The Chicago Commercial Harbour project. $120 million. I have to admit, Evelyn, I was impressed. You spent the last 2 years designing the biggest waterfront renovation in the city's history, just to hand it over to me when I returned to take the CEO chair. It is the perfect welcome home gift. It is the perfect wedding gift." I stared at him, genuinely fascinated by the sheer magnitude of his delusion. He truly believed the universe had paused the second he boarded that flight to Bali. He thought I had spent 2 agonizing years poring over CAD drawings, arguing with city planners, and pulling 80-hour work weeks just to construct a shiny throne for him to sit on. "There is one minor change we need to make to the team structure, though," Julian added casually, waving a hand toward the seating area. "Maya needs a proper title for her portfolio. We are going to name her the Creative Director of the Harbour Project." Maya perked up at this, batting her eyelashes. "I took a watercolour painting class in Ubud," she chimed in, her voice unnaturally breathy and high-pitched. I have a lot of really organic, fluid ideas for the concrete structures. I think the harbour needs to feel more vulnerable. I slowly lowered my gaze to Maya, then back to Julian. Maya's entire architectural experience consisted of finger painting and complaining about the Wi-Fi. Putting her in charge of a $120 million commercial infrastructure project was not just an insult to my career. It was an insult to basic human intelligence. So, Julian said, offering me that dazzling, hollow smile again. You are here to pick me up, hand over the project, and finally wear my ring. Let us go home. Evelyn. I slowly let out a breath. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I simply reached up with my right hand and smoothly slipped off my dark sunglasses, folding them with a crisp, decisive snap. I looked him dead in the eye, letting the cool, sterile light of the terminal reflect off the massive, flawless diamond resting on my left ring finger. I adjusted my silk cuff. The black town car. Julian's eyes dropped to my left hand. For a fraction of a second, his perfectly crafted smile faltered. His brow furrowed in confusion, his brain struggling to process a variable that did not fit into his carefully constructed fantasy. What is that? He asked, his voice losing a fraction of its smooth confidence. Evelyn, do not play games with me. You know I do not like it when you try to make me jealous. He reached out, his fingers aiming to grasp my chin, a patronising gesture he had used 100 times before to silence me. I did not even have to step back. Before his hand could make contact, the heavy, reinforced doors of the terminal slid open behind me. A sleek, armoured black Lincoln town car pulled up to the curb with silent, predatory grace. It was the kind of vehicle that commanded immediate compliance. The driver, wearing a pristine dark suit, stepped out immediately and opened the rear door. Julian's hand froze in midair. He recognised the licence plate. Every member of the Vance family recognised that plate. A man stepped out of the shadows of the back seat. He was 42 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit. Silver threaded through his dark hair, adding to the quiet, intimidating authority that radiated from his very presence. This was not a boy playing with corporate funds. This was the apex predator of the boardroom. This was Marcus Vance, the current CEO of Vance Holdings, and Julian's older half-brother. Julian swallowed hard, his face draining of colour. "Marcus!" he whispered, his voice cracking. "What are you doing here? Did Grandpa send you to pick me up?" Marcus did not even glance at Julian. He walked straight toward me, his stern, sculpted features softening into a look of absolute, unyielding warmth. He closed the distance between us, wrapped a strong arm around my waist, and pressed a tender kiss to my forehead. "I apologise for keeping you waiting, my love," Marcus murmured, his deep voice carrying easily over the ambient noise of the airport. The board meeting ran late. Julian stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck. Maya dropped her phone onto the polished floor with a sharp clatter. Leo just watched with wide, curious eyes. "A wife," Julian choked out, his eyes darting frantically between Marcus and the diamond on my finger. You married him. My brother." Marcus finally turned his head to look at Julian. There was no anger in his eyes, only the cold, clinical indifference one might reserve for a smudge of dirt on a window pane. "I married the woman I love," Marcus said, his tone perfectly level. "The fact that you were foolish enough to abandon her simply made it convenient." Marcus placed his hand on the small of my back, guiding me toward the waiting car. We did not look back. The silence was absolutely deafening. The wedding day echoes. The interior of the Lincoln Town car smelled faintly of bergamot, leather, and rain. The heavy doors shut with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly cutting off the noise of the airport and the pathetic, gaping expressions of Julian and Maya. I sank into the plush leather seat, exhaling a long, slow breath. Marcus reached over, his large, warm hand covering mine, his thumb drawing slow, grounding circles over my knuckles. I looked out the tinted window as the car merged onto the highway, watching the city skyline blur into streaks of grey and silver, despite the deep satisfaction blooming in my chest. A ghost of a memory forced its way into my mind. It was a Tuesday in July, exactly 2 years ago. The Grand Ballroom at the Plaza Hotel had been transformed into an architectural masterpiece of white orchids and imported silk. 300 of Chicago's most elite socialites, politicians, and business moguls had gathered, holding flutes of vintage champagne, waiting for the heir of the Vance Empire to walk down the aisle. I was in the bridal suite, wearing a custom gown that felt heavier by the second. Julian was standing by the window, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. "Maya, please." Julian had pleaded, his voice thick with panic. "Do not do this right now. I am about to walk down the aisle." I could hear Maya's hysterical, breathless sobbing through the receiver. "I cannot breathe, Julian." "The walls are closing in. I am at the international terminal. If you do not come right now, I swear I am going to buy a one-way ticket to Bali and you will never see me again. You are the only one who understands my trauma. You promised my dad you would protect me." Julian had slowly lowered the phone. He looked at me, his eyes entirely devoid of apology. "Evelyn, she's having a breakdown. She's too fragile. I have to go to her." "Julian," I had whispered, my voice trembling. 300 people are waiting. I am waiting." "You are strong, Evelyn," he had replied, already loosening his silk tie. "You can handle this. Maya cannot. I will be back in a few weeks. I promise." And just like that, he had walked out of the suite, leaving the door wide open. The ensuing chaos was a blur of humiliating pity. The whispers of the guests echoed off the marble walls like a physical assault. The sympathetic glances from the catering staff felt like acid on my skin. I had spent my entire life building a reputation as a fiercely competent, independent professional, only to be reduced to a tragic punchline in a matter of minutes. I squeezed Marcus's hand in the present, pulling myself out of the suffocating memory. I stood there completely alone. Invisible chains. For a long time, the question haunted me every single night. Why did I stay? Why did a woman with a master's degree in architecture, a woman who calculated structural loads and oversaw multi-million-dollar construction sites, tolerate being treated like a secondary option in her own relationship? The answer was not simple. It was not a sudden collapse. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of my foundation. In my profession, we call it differential settlement when one part of a building's support structure sinks faster than the rest, causing invisible fractures that eventually tear the entire building apart. Julian and Maya had mastered the art of differential settlement. They had engaged in a relentless, agonizing campaign of emotional manipulation. Every time I tried to set a boundary regarding Maya, Julian would spin it around on me. If I asked for a private dinner without his adopted sister crashing our date, I was labelled insensitive. If I pointed out that Maya was stealing money from his accounts, I was paranoid and jealous of an orphan. They gaslit me with such surgical precision that I eventually stopped trusting my own perception of reality. Maya weaponized her victimhood like a master tactician. Her father had died in a minor car accident while driving Julian to prep school years ago. It was tragic, but it was not Julian's fault. Yet, Maya used that guilt as an unlimited currency. She traded her tears for expensive handbags, luxury vacations, and ultimately, absolute control over Julian's life. I had fallen into the trap of learned helplessness. I convinced myself that I could fix the dynamic if I was just patient enough. If I was just understanding enough. Architects are trained to solve problems, to reinforce failing structures. I viewed Julian as a massive restoration project. I thought my logic and stability could cure his chaotic, guilt-driven attachment to Maya. I was wrong. You cannot fix a foundation that fundamentally wants to sink. By normalizing their toxic behavior, by smiling politely while Maya insulted my clothes and Julian dismissed my career, I had slowly abandoned my own dignity. I was a brilliant engineer who had willingly walked into a condemned building, pretending the cracks in the ceiling were just modern art. I had been my own worst enemy. The humiliation of being abandoned at the altar was not the tragedy. It was the brutal, necessary wrecking ball that finally demolished the illusion I had been living in. I was lost in the ruins of my bridal suite, staring blankly at the discarded veil on the floor, my mind calculating the sheer magnitude of the public embarrassment I was about to face. The silence in the room was crushing. Then Arthur opened the door, the vintage Mont Blanc. The heavy oak door of the bridal suite did not fly open with dramatic urgency. It opened slowly, with a steady, measured creak that commanded immediate attention. Chairman Arthur Vance stood in the doorway. At 80 years old, he relied heavily on a polished mahogany cane, but his posture was as straight and unyielding as a steel beam. He did not look at the scattered white roses or the discarded silk veil on the carpet. His sharp, calculating eyes locked directly onto mine. I expected an apology. I expected the patriarch of the Vance Empire to offer me platitudes, to tell me that Julian was just a confused young man who had made a terrible mistake. I braced myself for the typical billionaire damage control. Arthur did none of those things. He walked over to the mahogany vanity table, his cane thumping rhythmically against the hardwood floor. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. He placed it carefully onto the table. Then he retrieved a heavy, vintage Mont Blanc fountain pen, a piece I recognised as his personal favourite, the one he used to sign multi-million-dollar acquisitions. He laid the pen gently on top of the envelope. "Evelyn," Arthur said, his voice gravelly but devoid of any pity, "tears are a terrible waste of hydration, and Julian is a terrible waste of your intellect." I stood up slowly, the heavy layers of my wedding dress shifting around my legs. I looked at the envelope. "What is this, Arthur?" "This is not an apology," the old man replied smoothly. "This is a transfer of capital, seed money for sterling architecture, fully unencumbered. I have watched you design circles around every senior partner in my firm. You have the mind of a master builder, Evelyn, but you have been wasting your time trying to renovate a crumbling shack." He tapped his cane once against the floor. "Julian has made his choice. Now, you must make yours. You can walk out of here as a humiliated runaway bride, or you can walk out of here as the CEO of your own firm. I do not invest in victims, Evelyn. I invest in visionaries." I looked down at the vintage Mont Blanc pen. The gold trim caught the light from the chandelier. My heart, which had been racing with panic just moments before, suddenly slowed to a steady, rhythmic beat. The fog of manipulation that Julian and Maya had wrapped around my brain began to evaporate. Arthur was right. I was an architect. I built things that lasted for centuries. I did not need to beg a fragile, arrogant boy to stay with me. I reached out and picked up the pen. It felt heavy, balanced, and perfectly designed. I opened the envelope, pulled out the incorporation documents, and pressed the gold nib to the paper. I did not shed a single tear. I signed my name with absolute precision, pressing hard enough to leave an imprint on the desk beneath the paper. Arthur gave a single, satisfied nod. The ink flowed perfectly, blueprint of a new life. The silence following the cancelled wedding was absolute. I did not issue a public statement. I did not post a tearful explanation on social media. I did not block Julian's number, nor did I reach out to him. I simply allowed his existence to fade into the background noise of my life, like a radio left on in another room. When Maya posted photos of them drinking expensive cocktails on a beach in Bali, captioned with quotes about healing and chosen family, I did not even flinch. I had actual work to do. With Arthur's seed capital securely in my business account, I leased a raw industrial loft in the West Loop of Chicago. It had exposed brick walls, massive factory windows, and absolutely zero memories of Julian. I bought 3 drafting tables, a high-end espresso machine, and enough tracing paper to cover the city. I named the firm Sterling Architecture. I did not attach the Vance name to it. This was mine. For the first 6 months, I worked 80-hour weeks. The physical exhaustion was a luxury. It left no room for self-pity or regret. I poured every ounce of my frustration, my meticulous nature, and my analytical mind into my structural designs. I stopped attending elite social galas and started attending zoning board meetings. I traded my designer cocktail dresses for tailored blazers and steel-toed boots. People in the industry whispered, "Of course!" They called me the abandoned bride. They assumed I was pouring myself into my work as a trauma response. Let them whisper. I thought, let them underestimate me. In the world of commercial real estate, being underestimated is the greatest tactical advantage you can possibly have. My first solo project was a modest boutique hotel downtown. It was flawless. The project came in under budget and 3 weeks ahead of schedule. That success led to a corporate headquarters redesign, which led to a municipal contract. I built a reputation not for being charming or socially connected, but for being ruthlessly efficient. I learned to appreciate the cold, unyielding nature of concrete and steel. Unlike people, building materials do not lie. They do not manipulate you, and they do not make promises they cannot keep. If you calculate the load-bearing capacity correctly, the structure will stand. If you fail, it will collapse. It was a simple, honest physics that I found deeply comforting. Julian's absence was the greatest gift he could have ever given me, without his constant demands for attention. Without Maya's manufactured crises draining my energy, my mind was finally clear. I was no longer shrinking myself to fit into their chaotic, dramatic narrative. I was expanding to fill my own space. I drafted a new life, line by line. I built my own empire, the silence of success. The Chicago Commercial Harbor project was the crown jewel of the decade. The city wanted to revitalize the waterfront, transforming abandoned industrial docks into a sustainable, multi-use, commercial and residential hub. The budget was $120 million. Every major architectural firm in the Midwest submitted a bid. Most of them relied on flashy presentations, expensive 3D renderings, and long-standing political connections to win over the municipal board. I took a different approach. I relied on math. When I walked into the bidding room, I was the only woman at the table, and certainly the youngest lead architect present. The board members looked at me with polite skepticism. I did not offer them a charismatic smile. I stood at the podium, queued up my presentation, and systematically dismantled every environmental and logistical challenge the site presented. I showed them how to integrate the natural flow of Lake Michigan to reduce cooling costs by 20%. I provided structural blueprints that utilized reinforced, recycled materials, cutting the construction timeline by a full month. I did not sell them a dream. I sold them an undeniable, financially bulletproof reality. For 2 hours, I answered every aggressive, probing question with calm, factual precision. I knew the soil composition. I knew the wind shear calculations. I knew the exact zoning ordinances. When I finished speaking, the room was entirely silent. The chairman of the municipal board looked down at my proposal, then looked up at me, his expression shifting from skepticism to profound respect. Winning the harbour project changed everything. Sterling Architecture went from a respected boutique firm to an industry powerhouse overnight. The media stopped referring to me as Julian Vance's ex-fiancé and started calling me Chicago's top visionary architect. Through it all, I maintained my strict policy of silence regarding my personal life. The press tried to dig for drama. They wanted to know if I was angry at the Vance family or if I was trying to prove something to the man who left me. I never gave them a single quote. I refused to let Julian's name share a headline with my professional achievements. Success is often loud, but true power is completely silent. I did not need to scream my victory from the rooftops. I just needed to look at the Chicago skyline and know that I was going to reshape it. My revenge was not going to be a screaming match in a coffee shop. It was going to be cast in concrete, towering over the city for the next 100 years. The contract was finally mine. Marcus Vance. Marcus Vance did not enter my life like a knight in shining armour. I did not need rescuing, and he was not the type to play the hero. He entered my life as a strategic partner. As the CEO of Vance Holdings, Marcus oversaw the real estate development division that was frequently bidding on the same municipal plots my firm was designing. Our first real interaction happened 8 months after Julian left. It was midnight in a sterile conference room. We were the only 2 people left, reviewing a highly contested commercial zoning map. I expected Marcus to be like his younger half-brother entitled Loud and constantly demanding validation. Instead, Marcus was a masterclass in quiet authority. He read through a 50-page legal brief without speaking a single word. When he finally looked up, his observations were sharp, analytical, and completely devoid of ego. He did not talk over me. He listened. Your structural load calculations on page 12, Marcus had said, his deep voice breaking the silence. They are flawless, but you underestimated the city's tax incentive package by 3%. We can push for a wider profit margin. That night marked the beginning of a profound shift. We started working together on joint ventures. Vance Holdings provided the capital infrastructure, and Sterling Architecture provided the design. We were a devastatingly effective team. Slowly. The professional respect evolved into something deeper. Marcus noticed the small things. He knew I took my coffee black. He knew I needed absolute silence when reviewing structural blueprints. He never made me feel like I was too ambitious, too cold, or too difficult. Unlike Julian, who always needed me to shrink so he could feel large. Marcus stood beside me and encouraged me to take up more space. He was a man who understood the weight of responsibility. He carried the entire Vance empire on his shoulders, while Julian played with his trust fund on tropical islands. Marcus and I shared a fundamental understanding of duty, loyalty, and the sheer hard work required to build something real. Our romance was not a fiery, dramatic explosion. It was the slow, steady curing of high-grade concrete. It grew stronger and more resilient every single day. A year and a half after Julian's departure, Marcus asked me to marry him. There were no public spectacles. We stood in my loft, looking out at the city lights. We were married on a rainy Tuesday morning at the county courthouse. Arthur Vance was our only witness. I wore a simple white suit. Marcus held my hand with a grip that promised absolute, unwavering stability. I did not feel a shred of anxiety. There was no drama, no crying sister, no last-minute panic. There was only peace. He was my solid ground. The secret landlord. With a ring securely on my finger and my architectural firm dominating the market, I began the most critical phase of my long-term strategy. The Chicago Commercial Harbour project was massive, but the city only owned the waterfront boundaries. The 3 central plots of land, the crucial entry points required for logistics, transport, and the main commercial plaza were privately owned by a series of shell companies. Vance Holdings, under Marcus's direction, had won the primary development contract from the city. But the project could not break ground without securing those 3 core plots. Julian, completely oblivious in Bali, still held 20% of the Vance Holdings voting shares. I knew that the moment he returned, he would try to use those shares to hold the harbour project hostage. He would try to leverage his family name to regain control. I was not going to let that happen. Using the profits from Sterling Architecture, heavily backed by a silent, independent line of credit, I secured myself. I quietly purchased those 3 core plots. I did not use my name. I structured the acquisition through a private limited liability company, completely insulating the purchase from public records. It was a perfectly legal, ruthlessly efficient real estate maneuver. Vance Holdings was going to build the $120 million harbour, but they were going to build it on my land. I was the supreme landlord. Julian could scream about his family name all he wanted, but he could not move a single bulldozer without my explicit signature on a lease agreement. Marcus knew, of course. He found the strategy highly amusing. He appreciated the elegant brutality of a perfectly executed contract. Then, exactly 2 years after the cancelled wedding, the notification arrived. I was sitting in my office reviewing the final environmental impact study when an encrypted email from Vance Holdings' chief financial officer hit my inbox. It was a courtesy copy, sent to me as Marcus's wife. The subject line was simple: account overdraft. Julian had finally exhausted the generous credit limit Arthur had left open for him. The endless luxury villas, the designer clothes for Maya, the private flights the funds had run completely dry. The email indicated that Julian had booked 2 first-class tickets back to Chicago. He was coming home to demand his inheritance, unaware that the empire he thought he owned had fundamentally shifted beneath his feet. I closed the email and took a sip of my black coffee. I did not feel panic. I did not feel anger. I felt the cool, calculated anticipation of a chess player watching her opponent move his king exactly where she wanted it. The trap was already set, a haven for Leo. The heavy iron gates of the Vance estate swung open to admit the Lincoln town car. Marcus and I sat in the back seat in comfortable silence, leaving Julian, Maya, and little Leo to follow behind in the estate's secondary SUV. We arrived at the main house first. The historic mansion stood tall against the grey Chicago sky, its stone facade projecting wealth and generational power. We had barely stepped into the grand foyer when the front doors burst open again. Julian marched in, dragging his luggage, his voice immediately filling the massive space with unnecessary volume. "Tell the staff to prepare the south wing," Julian demanded to the head butler, acting as if he had not been gone for 2 years. "Maya needs the corner suite with the lake view. Her creative energy is very sensitive to lighting." Maya trailed behind him, already sighing heavily. "This marble floor is so cold. Julian, it really drains my aura. I need a hot bath drawn immediately." I stood next to Marcus near the grand staircase. I did not acknowledge their ridiculous demands. Instead, my gaze fell on Leo. The 8-year-old boy was standing near the heavy wooden doors, clutching his small backpack to his chest. He looked entirely overwhelmed, his small shoulders hunched forward. Nobody had offered to take his bag. Nobody had asked if he was hungry after the 15-hour flight. Without a word to Julian or Maya, I walked across the foyer. I knelt down slightly so I was at eye level with the boy. "Leo," I said softly, keeping my voice gentle, "would you like to come to the kitchen with me? I think the chef just made a fresh batch of chocolate chip cookies." Leo blinked, looking up at Julian nervously, but Julian was too busy arguing with the butler about the thermostat. Leo nodded slowly. I gently took his small hand and led him away from the screaming and the drama. The kitchen was warm, smelling of vanilla and roasted coffee. I pulled up a stool at the marble island and helped him sit down. I poured him a mug of warm milk and set a plate of cookies in front of him. "You dropped your crayons at the airport," I said, placing the small box on the counter. "Do you like to draw?" Leo took a hesitant bite of a cookie. "Yes, ma'am. I draw buildings, like castles." My heart softened completely. I looked at this quiet, observant child, trapped in the orbit of two profound narcissists. Julian and Maya used him as an accessory when it suited them, and ignored him when it didn't. I recognised that profound, invisible loneliness. It was the exact same loneliness I had felt 2 years ago, trapped in their web. I rested my hand on the cool marble counter. I made a silent, unshakable vow right then and there. I would not let them ruin this boy. I would protect this child, the eve of the storm. The penthouse apartment Marcus and I shared was a sanctuary of glass, steel, and quiet warmth. It overlooked the sprawling expanse of Lake Michigan, providing a breathtaking view of the city skyline that I was currently helping to reshape. On Sunday evening, the apartment was perfectly still. Rain lashed gently against the floor-to-ceiling windows, distorting the golden streetlights below into abstract watercolour streaks. I stood by the large mahogany desk in my home office, methodically organising the physical files I would need for the board meeting the next morning. I did not feel any anxiety. My hands were perfectly steady as I aligned the edges of the heavy parchment paper, securing them into a thick leather binder. Every single document was categorised, indexed, and legally verified. I was an architect preparing for a final structural inspection. Marcus walked into the office, carrying 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. He set one down near my hand and leaned against the edge of the desk. Crossing his arms, he watched me with that quiet, intense gaze that always made me feel completely seen and understood. We had spent the entire weekend ignoring the frantic escalating emails from Julian's newly hired legal counsel, who had been aggressively demanding a seat at the Monday morning executive meeting. "You are checking the load-bearing calculations again," Marcus observed, his voice a low, comforting rumble in the quiet room. "I am simply ensuring the foundation is absolutely secure," I replied smoothly, picking up the mug and letting the heat warm my palms. Julian is unpredictable when he feels cornered. Maya is even worse. She will likely attempt to create a scene to garner sympathy from the older board members. We need to be prepared for an emotional performance. Marcus reached out, his strong fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. He was the current chief executive officer of the empire his family had built. Yet, he never carried that arrogance into our home. He understood power better than anyone, which meant he knew exactly when to wield it and when to withhold it. "They do not understand what they are walking into tomorrow," Marcus said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his mouth. Julian still believes this company operates on sentiment and inherited entitlement. He thinks the boardroom is a dining table where he can throw a tantrum and get his way. I leaned into Marcus's touch, closing my eyes for a brief second to absorb the deep, unshakable stability he provided. We were not just husband and wife, we were a fortified structure. We had spent 2 years building an impenetrable wall of legal and financial security, while Julian had spent 2 years drinking margaritas and complaining about the humidity in the tropics. "He is going to demand the harbour project," I said quietly, opening my eyes to look at the dark, turbulent waters of the lake in the distance. Marcus picked up his coffee, his expression turning cold and clinical. "Let him dig his own grave." The war began on Monday morning, the boardroom invasion. At exactly 9 o'clock on Monday morning, the executive boardroom on the top floor of Vance Holdings was already buzzing with high-stakes tension. 10 senior board members, all seasoned veterans of the Chicago real estate and finance sectors, sat around the massive oval glass table. The air smelled of expensive espresso, polished wood, and billions of dollars in active municipal contracts. I stood at the head of the table wearing a sharply tailored navy blue suit. The projector behind me displayed the finalised, highly complex logistical timelines for the commercial harbour development. I was in the middle of explaining the phased concrete pouring schedule when the heavy, double oak doors at the back of the room burst open. The interruption was so loud, so violently out of place in the sterile corporate environment that several board members physically jumped in their leather chairs. Julian marched into the room as if he were leading a victorious parade. He was wearing a light linen suit that was entirely inappropriate for a Chicago autumn, paired with an open-collared shirt that exposed a gold chain. He looked like a man arriving at a country club, not a corporate war room. Maya trailed closely behind him, clutching an oversized leather portfolio to her chest, her eyes wide and calculating as she scanned the room to assess her audience. "Stop the presentation," Julian announced loudly, his voice echoing off the soundproofed walls. He waved his hand dismissively toward the projection screen, as if swatting away a minor annoyance. "There is no need to review these preliminary schedules. The leadership structure of this project is changing as of today." I did not flinch. I did not reach for my laser pointer, nor did I attempt to shout over him. I simply lowered my hands, clasped them loosely in front of me, and watched him with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a highly predictable yet destructive chemical reaction. The senior board members exchanged bewildered glances. A few of them frowned, their impatience visibly mounting. They were men and women who valued their time in increments of thousands of dollars per minute. Julian's dramatic entrance was not just rude, it was incredibly expensive. "Julian," one of the older directors said, his tone thick with irritation. "This is a closed executive session regarding a $120 million municipal contract. You have been absent for 2 years. You cannot simply walk in here and interrupt the lead architect." "I am the heir to the Vance family," Julian shot back, puffing out his chest and stepping closer to the glass table. "And I am officially back to take over the harbour development. Evelyn has done an adequate job keeping the seat warm, but this requires true family leadership. Furthermore, Maya is stepping in immediately as the executive creative director." I stood perfectly still, observing his delusion. The silence was absolutely paralysing. The audacity of mediocrity. Maya took Julian's announcement as her cue to perform. She stepped out from behind him, placing her oversized leather portfolio onto the pristine glass table with a heavy, dramatic thud. She looked around the room, her lower lip quivering slightly, projecting an aura of fragile brilliance that she clearly thought would captivate the hardened executives sitting before her. "I know I have been away, healing from my father's tragic accident," Maya said, her voice breathy and thoroughly rehearsed. "But the spiritual journey I took in Bali really opened my eyes to spatial dynamics. The current blueprints Evelyn has presented are incredibly rigid. They lack emotional flow. I have prepared some alternative concepts that will bring a much softer, more feminine energy to the commercial harbour." She unzipped the portfolio and began sliding massive sheets of paper across the table. The board members leaned forward, their expressions shifting from irritation to sheer, unadulterated shock. The papers were not architectural drafts. They were not CAD renderings or structural load estimates. They were loose, amateurish watercolour paintings. One depicted a dock that appeared to be melting into a purple ocean. Another showed a cargo warehouse painted in pastel pink, completely lacking any structural support columns or logistical entry points. "This," Maya whispered, pointing a manicured finger at a blob of blue paint, "is where the cargo ships will dock. I want the concrete to be replaced with ethically sourced bamboo so the ships feel welcomed by nature." A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the boardroom. The chief financial officer, a stern woman in her 60s, slowly picked up the bamboo sketch, holding it between 2 fingers as if it were a biohazard. She looked at Maya, then at Julian, her face completely blank. "You want to support thousands of tons of industrial commercial shipping weight," the financial officer said slowly, articulating every single syllable. "With bamboo," Julian, completely oblivious to the profound mockery in her tone, nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. It is innovative. Evelyn is too stuck in the past, too obsessed with math and engineering. We need Maya's vision to secure the future of this company. If you do not immediately ratify this change in leadership, I will use my 20% future voting shares to veto the entire project. He crossed his arms, leaning back on his heels, thoroughly convinced he had just delivered a masterstroke of corporate strategy. He had played his trump card. He believed that the sheer threat of his family name and his supposed future wealth would bring the entire room to its knees. He believed I would step away from the podium in tears, utterly defeated by his overwhelming authority. I looked at the ridiculous watercolour paintings scattered across the table. And then I looked directly at Julian. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I only felt a deep, profound pity for a man who had no idea the ground beneath him had vanished. He threatened an empty room. Justice by documentation. Julian stood at the edge of the table, exuding the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he held all the cards. He thought his 20% future voting shares were a loaded weapon aimed directly at my career. He assumed corporate power was an inherent birthright, an invisible shield that would forever protect him from the consequences of his own staggering incompetence. He was fundamentally wrong. In the world of high finance and corporate governance, power does not exist in the bloodline. Power exists in the paperwork. When Arthur Vance established the family's estate planning, he did not simply hand over 20% of a multi-billion-dollar empire to an arrogant boy. He placed those shares into an irrevocable trust. For those outside the financial sector, an irrevocable trust is exactly what it sounds like: a fortress. Once the assets are placed inside, the terms cannot be modified, amended, or terminated without the permission of the beneficiary and the grantor. It is a legal vault designed to protect wealth from creditors, but more importantly, to protect the wealth from reckless heirs. But Arthur was a brilliant, meticulous man. He had included a very specific, heavily ironclad moral turpitude clause within the trust's foundational documents. The clause explicitly stated that the beneficiary would forfeit all voting rights and future distributions if they engaged in conduct that brought significant public humiliation or reputational damage to the Vance family. By abandoning a highly publicised 300-guest society wedding to chase a fabricated emotional crisis in a foreign country, Julian had detonated a public relations disaster. He had embarrassed the patriarch. He had humiliated the family name. And by doing so, he had legally, permanently triggered the forfeiture clause. Julian's shares were not a weapon. They were dust. They had been absorbed back into the primary holding company 24 months ago, completely neutralising his authority within the corporation. He had spent 2 years bragging about wealth that no longer belonged to him, entirely unaware that the legal machinery of the trust had already executed his financial execution. Words can be twisted, emotional arguments can be manipulated. A narcissist will always find a way to make themselves the victim in a conversation, but documents do not care about your feelings. A notarized signature, a corporate seal, and a legally binding trust agreement are the ultimate undeniable truth. They are immune to gaslighting. They are immune to tears. If you believe that cold, hard facts are the best revenge against manipulation, let me know in the comments below. I watched Julian pace back and forth, completely unaware of his own irrelevance. I let him speak. I let him dig his own grave a little deeper, providing the board members with an unforgettable demonstration of exactly why he was unfit to lead. The trap was closing fast, the calm before the strike. The tension in the boardroom was thick enough to crack glass. The senior executives were staring at Julian with a mixture of horror and mounting fury. Maya was standing near the door, her lower lip still trembling, waiting for someone to praise her absurd watercolour sketches. Everyone's eyes eventually shifted to me, waiting for the inevitable explosion. They expected the abandoned bride to finally snap, to scream, to demand that security remove the man who had humiliated her 2 years prior. I did not give them the satisfaction of a breakdown. I moved away from the presentation podium with deliberate, measured steps. The heels of my shoes clicked softly against the hardwood floor, a steady, rhythmic sound that cut through the heavy silence. I walked back to my seat at the centre of the table and sat down. I smoothed the lapels of my navy jacket, maintaining a posture of absolute, unbothered control. "Evelyn," Julian sneered, interpreting my silence as surrender. He leaned over the table, placing both hands flat on the glass, trying to physically loom over me. "Do not make this harder than it needs to be. Step down gracefully. Hand the project files over to Maya's assistant. If you walk away quietly, I will make sure you receive a generous severance package." I did not answer him immediately. I reached out and pulled my leather briefcase closer. The brass clasps opened with 2 sharp, metallic clicks. I slid my hand inside and withdrew the heavy, vintage Mont Blanc fountain pen that Chairman Arthur Vance had given me in the bridal suite 2 years ago. Twos. I placed the pen on the glass table. I let my index finger tap the gold cap. Once, twice. The small, sharp sound seemed to echo in the cavernous room. "Mr. Davis," I said, my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of anger or distress. I looked at the lead technical assistant standing near the back wall. "Please switch the projector input from the architectural timeline to the legal encrypted drive. Password authorization requires my secondary clearance." The assistant nodded rapidly, his fingers flying across his keyboard. Julian frowned, his posture faltering slightly. The triumphant smirk on his face began to waver, replaced by a sudden, creeping shadow of doubt. He looked down at the Mont Blanc pen resting near my hands, a spark of recognition flashing in his eyes. "What are you doing?" Julian demanded, his voice rising in pitch, a sharp edge of panic bleeding into his tone. "I told you, I have veto power. I have 20% of this company. You cannot authorize anything without my approval." I picked up the pen and rolled it slowly between my fingers. I looked up at him, my expression entirely cold, entirely analytical. "You have nothing. Julian?" The chairman's shadow. Before Julian could process my words, before he could open his mouth to launch another desperate, arrogant threat, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open for a second time. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely lacking the chaotic energy of Julian's earlier entrance. Every head in the room turned. The chief financial officer immediately sat up straighter. The senior directors adjusted their ties. Chairman Arthur Vance stepped into the room. At 80 years old, the patriarch of the Vance Empire still commanded the kind of terrifying, absolute authority that could silence a room of billionaires with a single glance. He leaned heavily on his polished mahogany cane, his silver hair perfectly combed, his bespoke suit immaculate. He did not look like an old man visiting his company. He looked like a sovereign inspecting his territory. Julian's face lit up with desperate relief. He completely abandoned his aggressive posture over the table and rushed toward the door, throwing his arms open wide to welcome his grandfather. He had clearly convinced himself that Arthur had come to support his grand return, to validate his erratic behaviour, and to publicly hand him the keys to the kingdom. "Grandpa," Julian exclaimed, his voice practically vibrating with joy. "You made it! I was just explaining to the board that I am ready to take over the harbour project. Maya and I have incredible plans for the waterfront." Arthur did not stop walking. He did not pause to embrace his grandson. He did not even look at Maya, who was standing frozen near the wall, her watercolour paintings suddenly looking incredibly foolish under the old man's severe gaze. Arthur moved past Julian as if the younger man were nothing more than a piece of uninteresting furniture blocking his path. Julian stumbled slightly, his arms falling to his sides, his triumphant smile shattering into pieces. He spun around, watching in complete, bewildered horror as Arthur walked directly toward the head of the long glass table. Arthur pulled out the heavy leather executive chair immediately to my right. He sat down slowly, resting his hands on the top of his mahogany cane. He looked around the silent boardroom, his sharp, predatory gaze lingering on the nervous faces of his executives before finally settling on Julian, who was standing awkwardly in the centre of the room. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The air was thick, suffocating, and charged with undeniable consequence. "Are you ready to see arrogance destroyed? Keep listening." Arthur turned his head slightly, acknowledging my presence with a short, respectful nod. He did not look at the man who shared his blood. He looked at the woman who had protected his legacy. "Begin the presentation. Evelyn, the setup." The projector hummed quietly overhead, slicing through the heavy silence of the boardroom. The massive screen illuminated the dark walls, displaying the finalized organizational chart for the $120 million commercial harbor development. Arthur sat to my right, perfectly still, his wrinkled hands resting firmly on the head of his mahogany cane. He did not say a single word. He simply let the brilliant, undeniable reality of the corporate structure speak for itself. Julian stepped closer to the screen. He squinted, his eyes darting frantically across the interconnected boxes, searching for his own name. He looked for the title of Chief Project Director. He looked for Maya's designated position as Creative Executive. He found absolutely nothing. The highest box on the chart belonged to Marcus, listed as the Chief Executive Officer of Vance Holdings. The parallel box, connected by a solid, unyielding line of equal authority, belonged to me. I was listed as the lead architect and the primary land proprietor. Below us were dozens of senior engineers, municipal liaisons, and logistics managers. Julian's name did not exist in any capacity. Maya's name was entirely absent. A violent flush of absolute rage crept up Julian's neck, turning his face a deep, mottled crimson. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice cracking as he slammed his palm flat against the thick glass table. "Where is my name? Where is Maya's position?" I pressed the small button on my presentation remote. The slide shifted, bringing up the finalized legal structure of the development, complete with digital watermarks from the City Zoning Commission. "This is the operational reality. Julian," I said, my voice as calm and steady as a ticking metronome. He lost whatever fragile shred of composure he had left. The illusion of the sophisticated air evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, cornered boy. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, completely ignoring the horrified stares of the senior board members sitting around the table. "You manipulated him," Julian spat, gesturing wildly toward Arthur, who remained entirely impassive. "You wormed your way into my family. You could not handle being rejected, so you married my brother just to steal my inheritance. You are a fraud. You are nothing but a gold-digging parasite trying to play billionaire using my family's money." A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the boardroom. The chief financial officer actually covered her mouth with her hand. Arthur's grip on his cane tightened noticeably, his knuckles turning white, but I raised my left hand slightly, silently asking the patriarch to wait. I did not need a defender. I looked at Julian, taking in his desperate, flailing anger. I did not feel insulted. I did not feel the urge to defend my long hours, my sleepless nights, or my heavily fortified bank account to a man who had never balanced a ledger in his entire life. I simply offered him a very small, incredibly polite smile. "Are you quite finished, Julian?" The room held its breath. Toxic pity. Sensing that Julian's aggressive tactics were failing spectacularly. Maya immediately deployed her primary weapon. She stepped forward from the corner of the room, her eyes rapidly filling with tears. She let out a pathetic, trembling sob that echoed through the quiet space, pressing both hands against her chest as if she were in physical pain. "How can you be so cruel?" "Evelyn," Maya cried, her voice echoing with manufactured devastation. "Julian is just trying to protect me. You all know what I have been through. My father died to save this family. He gave his life for the Vance Empire, and this is how you treat his daughter. You owe me. You all owe me." It was the exact same manipulative script she had used for years. It was the toxic pity that had paralysed Julian and guilt-tripped the entire family into absolute submission. But I was entirely immune to her performance. I opened my leather folder and pulled out a single, heavily printed sheet of paper. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the cadence of an auditor reading a balance sheet. "Your father was a dedicated driver who tragically passed away in an accident caused by black ice," I stated calmly, looking directly into Maya's tear-filled eyes. "It was a horrific loss. But let us be mathematically precise about the debt this family supposedly owes you." I glanced down at the document. "Over the past 5 years, the Vance Family Trust has disbursed exactly $4,250,000 for your personal expenses. This includes your tuition at 3 different private universities, none of which you finished. It includes a luxury apartment lease in Paris, 6-figure shopping sprees in Milan, and a limitless corporate credit card that you have systematically abused to fund a permanent vacation." Maya froze. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The tears stopped flowing instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. "The Vance family honoured your father's memory by ensuring you would never know financial hardship," I continued, my voice perfectly level. "They provided you with every opportunity to build a meaningful life. You chose to build a career as a professional victim instead. You used a tragedy as a blank check to avoid accountability." I placed the paper back into the folder and closed it with a soft click. "The financial debt has been paid in full. Maya, with interest. My capacity for toxic pity expired on the day you destroyed my wedding to fund your spiritual retreat. You have exhausted your leverage." Maya looked around the room, desperately seeking a sympathetic face to rescue her. The board members stared back at her with absolute disgust. The financial officer was shaking her head slowly. Maya shrank back against the wall. Her entire illusion of fragile innocence shattered into irreparable pieces. She had absolutely nothing left. The power flip. Julian frantically tried to recover the lost ground. "Fine," he snapped, waving away Maya's humiliation as if she were a minor inconvenience. "You can cut her off, but you cannot cut me out. I own 20% of the future voting shares. If you do not give me the director position on the harbour project, I will block the construction permits. I will drag this company into litigation for the next decade. You cannot build anything without my consent." I looked across the table at Marcus. My husband gave me a single, approving nod. It was time to close the trap. "Julian," I said gently, almost sympathetically, "you cannot block the construction permits for the commercial harbour. You do not have the jurisdiction." "I am a major shareholder of Vance Holdings." He fired back, his face turning red again. "Vance Holdings owns the development contract," I corrected him smoothly. "But Vance Holdings does not own the physical ground beneath the project." I picked up the presentation remote and clicked it one final time. The screen behind me shifted, displaying 3 highly detailed, legally notarized land deeds. The documents were stamped with the official seal of the Cook County Assessor's Office. They represented the 3 massive, interconnected plots of waterfront land that formed the absolute core of the commercial harbour footprint. Without those specific parcels, The entire $120 million project was physically impossible to build. Julian squinted at the massive documents. What is this? Read the name on the title, Julian, Arthur commanded, his voice rumbling like thunder. Julian's eyes tracked across the illuminated screen. He read the bold, black text aloud, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. Evelyn Sterling Vance? I purchased those core plots 18 months ago, I explained. Leaning back comfortably in my chair, I am the sole proprietor of the land. Vance Holdings cannot lay a single foundation without a land lease agreement signed explicitly by me. You cannot block a project on property you do not own. Julian stared at me, his reality fracturing completely. He looked back at Arthur, desperate for an intervention. Arthur struck his cane against the floor. The sound was like a gavel falling in a courtroom. Your 20% trust allocation was contingent upon a strict moral turpitude clause. Julian, the patriarch stated coldly. When you abandoned your responsibilities and humiliated this family 2 years ago, you triggered the forfeiture protocol. You do not own 20%. You own absolutely nothing. Arthur looked at me, then at Marcus. The entire holding company now belongs to Marcus and Evelyn. They are the true future of this empire. Marcus leaned forward, interlacing his fingers. You are currently standing in my boardroom. Julian, my husband added, his voice low and dangerous. And my company is currently renting the waterfront from my wife. You have absolutely no authority. The begging. The devastating reality of his situation finally crashed down upon Julian. The arrogant, entitled heir who had strolled into the boardroom demanding control was gone. In his place stood a terrified, financially ruined man who suddenly realized he had no safety net, no credit cards, and no future. The transformation was incredibly pathetic to witness. His broad shoulders slumped forward. The confident sneer melted into an expression of sheer, suffocating panic. He looked wildly around the room, but the senior executives were actively avoiding eye contact, completely disgusted by his public display. Maya was still backed into the corner, staring blankly at the floor, processing the undeniable fact that her primary source of infinite funding had just been vaporized. Julian's eyes darted back and forth before locking onto me. He took a staggering step forward, his polished shoes scuffing loudly against the pristine hardwood floor. Before anyone could call security, he dropped to his knees right beside my leather executive chair. Evelyn, please! Julian begged, his voice trembling, actual tears welling up in his eyes. He reached out and grabbed the armrest of my chair, his fingers brushing against the sleeve of my navy jacket. You cannot do this to me. We were supposed to get married. You loved me. I know I made a mistake, but I am back now. I can change. We can go back to how things were. I looked down at the man kneeling beside me. 2 years ago, seeing him in distress would have triggered my deeply ingrained instinct to fix the problem, to soothe his anxieties, to shrink my own needs to accommodate his fragile ego. Now, looking at his tear-stained face, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering affection. There was no residual anger. There was only a profound, liberating sense of closure. I slowly, deliberately pulled my arm away from his desperate grasp. I reached into my pocket, withdrew a clean white handkerchief, and gently wiped the fabric of my sleeve where his fingers had made contact. Julian stared at the handkerchief, his mouth hanging open in shock. The gesture was completely silent, yet it communicated a level of utter disdain that words could never achieve. There is no going back. Julian, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yet it carried clearly across the silent boardroom. You made your choice the morning of our wedding. You walked out the door to chase a manufactured crisis, and you left me to deal with the public wreckage. I placed the folded handkerchief on the glass table. You destroyed the foundation we had built. You cannot show up 2 years later and expect to move back into a house that no longer exists. Julian continued to sob, his head bowed in absolute defeat. Grandpa, please, he whimpered, looking toward Arthur. You dug this grave yourself, Arthur replied without mercy. Do not soil my carpet, the forged intent. Just as Julian buried his face in his hands, the heavy oak doors opened one more time. A man in a sharp grey suit walked in, carrying a slim leather briefcase. It was Gregory, Julian's aggressively expensive personal attorney, the one he had retained using the last of his family credit line months ago. Gregory surveyed the room, his eyes lingering on Julian kneeling on the floor, before turning his attention directly to me. This meeting is far from over, Gregory announced, his voice practically dripping with legal arrogance. He marched toward the glass table, unsnapped his briefcase, and pulled out a single, heavily creased document. He slapped it down right next to my folded handkerchief. Julian looked up, a sudden desperate spark of hope reigniting in his tear-filled eyes. He scrambled to his feet, wiping his face. Yes, Julian hissed, finding his courage again. Show them. What you are looking at is a legally binding letter of intent, Gregory stated, tapping the paper with his index finger. Signed by Evelyn Sterling exactly 2.5 years ago, during the formation of her initial architectural consulting firm. In this document, Ms. Sterling explicitly promises 30% of all future corporate equity and land acquisitions to my client, Julian Vance, in exchange for his early consultation services. The boardroom went completely still. A collective breath caught in the throats of the senior executives. If the document was valid, Julian essentially owned nearly 1/3 of my firm and 1/3 of the crucial waterfront land. He could still force his way into the project. He could still hold the entire harbour hostage. Julian crossed his arms, the arrogant smirk returning to his face. You forgot about that little contract, didn't you, Evelyn? You cannot outsmart me. I did not gasp. I did not pale. I did not even lean forward to inspect the outdated piece of paper. I simply looked at Marcus. Marcus smiled, a slow, predatory expression, and nodded at our lead corporate attorney, Vivian, who was sitting quietly at the far end of the table. Vivian stood up. She did not raise her voice. She simply slid a thick, blue-bound dossier across the polished glass until it stopped directly in front of Gregory. That letter of intent was drafted, I explained, my voice echoing with absolute tranquility. But it was contingent upon a standard ethical compliance clause. When Julian abandoned his fiancée at the altar, causing massive public reputational damage to the primary shareholder, the letter was automatically rendered null and void. Gregory frowned, opening the blue dossier. What you are looking at now, I continued, is the official rescission notice, filed and stamped by the Securities and Exchange Commission exactly 24 months ago. It legally terminates the agreement. Your document is entirely worthless. Gregory stared at the undeniable federal seal. The colour drained completely from his face. Without a single word, the attorney closed the blue dossier, picked up his useless paper, snapped his briefcase shut, and walked straight out the door. He did not even look at his client. Julian watched his lawyer abandon him in absolute horror. The game was finally over. The crumbling empire. The collapse of Julian's fabricated reality was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonising structural failure. 3 months after the disastrous confrontation in the boardroom, the consequences of his actions fully settled into the concrete reality of his new life. The Vance Family Trust had been ruthlessly efficient. Arthur had not simply frozen Julian's accounts, he had legally severed all financial ties, leaving his grandson to navigate the brutal world without the protective shield of the family name. Julian was forced to vacate his luxury penthouse and lease a cramped, one-bedroom apartment in a noisy industrial neighbourhood. He had traded his tailored linen suits for cheap, ill-fitting polyester. He found a job selling mid-tier commercial insurance, sitting in a windowless cubicle under flickering fluorescent lights. He tried to leverage his last name to secure affluent clients, but the Chicago business elite already knew the truth. They knew he had been publicly disinherited, stripped of his shares, and thoroughly humiliated by the woman he had abandoned. When he called to offer them insurance policies, they either laughed or simply hung up the phone. The arrogance that had defined his entire existence was slowly being ground into dust by the relentless pressure of working 40 hours a week just to pay for basic utilities. Maya's reality check was equally devastating. Without Julian's unlimited credit cards to fund her lavish lifestyle and imaginary trauma retreats, she was forced to face the real world. She moved out of the Vance estate the same day Julian was officially removed from the corporate registry. She took a job as a waitress at a busy, unforgiving cafe in the suburbs. During her first week, she attempted to use her standard manipulation tactics. When she accidentally dropped a tray of expensive ceramics, she immediately burst into tears, dramatically clutching her chest and crying about how overwhelmed her aura felt. She expected the manager to comfort her, to offer her a paid day off, to treat her with the toxic pity she had weaponized her entire life. Instead, the manager handed her a mop and a bottle of industrial cleaner, completely unbothered by her performance. He told her that if the floor was not spotless in 10 minutes, the cost of the broken ceramics would be deducted from her next paycheck. Maya stared at the mop in absolute horror, realizing for the very first time that her tears held absolutely zero currency in the real world. No one cared about her manufactured victimhood. No one was going to rescue her from the consequences of her own mediocrity. They were forced to live ordinary, incredibly difficult lives, entirely separated from the wealth and prestige they had arrogantly taken for granted. They had spent years building a tower out of manipulation, lies, and emotional abuse, only to watch it collapse the moment the financial support pillars were finally removed. They had absolutely nothing left. Blossoming aftermath. Spring arrived in Chicago with a crisp, rejuvenating breeze coming off Lake Michigan. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, perfectly framing the massive steel and glass structures of the newly completed commercial harbour. The waterfront, which had once been a desolate stretch of decaying industrial docks, was now a vibrant, sustainable hub of global commerce and modern architecture. It was the crowning achievement of my career and the defining physical manifestation of my ultimate victory. Hundreds of people gathered on the main plaza for the official ribbon-cutting ceremony. City officials, wealthy investors, and members of the press stood near the massive concrete barriers, marvelling at the clean lines and the flawless integration of natural green spaces. The project had been completed exactly on schedule and significantly under budget. I stood on the elevated presentation stage, wearing a tailored white suit that caught the morning sunlight. The wind gently pulled at my hair, but I felt completely grounded. Marcus stood directly to my right, looking incredibly handsome in his dark charcoal suit. He did not try to steal the spotlight or claim credit for the design. He stood beside me as an equal partner, his quiet strength radiating a deep, unshakable pride. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped up to the podium. The crowd quieted immediately. I did not mention the struggles of the past 2 years. I did not mention the betrayal, the humiliation, or the desperate attempts by Julian to sabotage this exact moment. I spoke about the future. I spoke about the resilience of the city, the strength of the structural foundation, and the incredible team of engineers who had brought my vision to life. But I had one final announcement to make. This harbour represents the future of commercial logistics in the Midwest, I said into the microphone, my voice echoing clearly across the vast plaza. But a city's true infrastructure is not built solely with concrete and steel. It is built by supporting the next generation of visionaries. I gestured toward the newly constructed community centre at the edge of the harbour. Today, in partnership with Vance Holdings. I am incredibly proud to announce the opening of the Arthur Vance Foundation. This endowment, funded entirely by the profits of this harbour project, will provide full academic scholarships and dedicated mentorship programmes for orphaned and underprivileged children who wish to pursue degrees in architecture and civil engineering. The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause. The cameras flashed in a continuous, blinding wave. I looked out at the sea of faces, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over me. The wealth and power that Julian had tried to hoard for his own selfish vanity was now being used to systematically dismantle the kind of quiet, desperate loneliness that children like his nephew had been forced to endure. The foundation was finally secure. The new family. Sunday mornings at the penthouse were sacred. The sprawling apartment was bathed in soft, golden sunlight that reflected off the dark hardwood floors. There were no frantic phone calls, no dramatic interruptions, and absolutely no lingering shadows of the toxic chaos that had once tried to consume my life. The air smelled of freshly brewed espresso and the warm, buttery scent of pancakes baking on the kitchen griddle. I walked out of the master bedroom, holding a steaming mug of black coffee, and paused near the entrance of the living room. Leo was sitting at the massive drafting table I had set up near the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was deeply focused, his small brow furrowed in concentration as he carefully guided a heavy metal ruler across a sheet of tracing paper. He was not drawing fantasy castles anymore. He was drawing complex, structurally sound bridges, meticulously mapping out the load-bearing supports just as I had taught him the day before. The transformation in the 8-year-old boy was nothing short of miraculous. The nervous, flinching child who had dropped his crayons at the airport was gone. In his place was a confident, quietly brilliant kid who felt completely safe in his environment. On Friday afternoon, the family court had officially finalised the adoption papers. The legal process had been swift, heavily expedited by Vance Holdings' formidable legal team. Julian and Maya had not even attempted to contest the filings. They simply did not have the financial resources, nor did they truly care enough to fight for a child they had only ever viewed as an inconvenience. Marcus walked out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dark linen towel. He stopped beside me, wrapping his arm around my waist and pulling me close. We stood together in comfortable silence, watching our son carefully shade the concrete pillars of his bridge design. His structural proportions are actually quite impressive, Marcus murmured softly, a smile touching his lips. He is definitely taking after his mother. I leaned my head against Marcus's shoulder, a deep, overwhelming wave of gratitude settling into my chest. This was the family I had always wanted. It was not built on the fragile, unstable ground of manipulation or empty, performative promises. It was built on a foundation of mutual respect, genuine care, and absolute consistency. We did not demand that Leo fit into a preconceived mould. We simply provided him with a safe space to design his own life. Leo suddenly stopped drawing, looked up, and noticed us watching him. A bright, genuine smile spread across his face, reaching all the way to his eyes. He hopped off the drafting stool and ran toward us, wrapping his arms tightly around Marcus's legs. Marcus chuckled, lifting the boy effortlessly and spinning him around the sunlit room. He was finally home now, the masterpiece. I stepped out onto the wide glass balcony of the penthouse, leaving the joyful sounds of Marcus and Leo in the living room behind me. The cold autumn wind whipped through my hair, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of the city. I placed my hands on the freezing steel railing and looked out at the sprawling, magnificent Chicago skyline. Far in the distance, I could see the massive, angular silhouettes of the commercial harbour cranes moving methodically against the grey clouds. That was my land. That was my design. I thought back to the woman I'd been 2 years ago. I thought about the terrified, humiliated bride standing in a hotel suite surrounded by discarded white orchids, wondering how she was going to survive the public disgrace of being abandoned. I had felt so incredibly small in that moment, convinced that Julian possessed the power to completely destroy my worth. I smiled to myself. He had not destroyed me. He had simply cleared the plot. He had removed a decaying, unstable structure, leaving me with the empty space required to construct an empire. I had learned the most valuable lesson of my entire life. A true legacy is not inherited through blood, trust funds, or empty, dramatic promises whispered in an airport terminal. A true legacy is meticulously built, blueprint, by those who refuse to be broken by the arrogance of others. You do not achieve justice by screaming at the people who hurt you. You achieve justice by rendering them completely, mathematically irrelevant to your success. Julian and Maya were nothing more than a minor miscalculation in the early drafts of my life. I had corrected the error. I had reinforced the load-bearing walls. I had partnered with a man who matched my intellectual weight, and together we were raising a son who would learn the absolute value of integrity over entitlement. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold, electric air of the city I had helped redesign. I did not hold any anger in my heart. The scales had been perfectly, legally balanced. The Vance name was no longer a symbol of inherited arrogance. It was a testament to architectural brilliance and unyielding resilience. I turned around, leaving the cold wind behind, and walked back inside to join my family. If this story reminded you of your own strength to walk away from toxic situations and rebuild your life from the ground up, share this video to inspire someone else who might be standing in the ruins right now. Remember, the best revenge is a life brilliantly lived. I never looked back again.